Good evening and welcome to St. John's Lutheran Church and the first program in our 2023 Third Thursday Lecture Series. All of us at the Monroe County Historical Association want to thank all of the folks here at St. John's for hosting our event this evening. Because of the construction at the Stroud Mansion, we are unable to use that, so we had to go out and find 6 venues for the lecture series for this season. And I have to tell you that the people and the venues in Monroe County were more than welcoming to us, and we certainly do appreciate that. Tonight, discussing religious dynamics in the making of Monroe County, we have Dr. Anthony Stevens-Arroyo, Professor Emeritus and former Director of Studies of Religion at Brooklyn College. He holds a doctorate from Fordham University and has published extensively on religious movements and history. He is active in many local organizations and he currently serves on the board of directors at MCHA. I am, and I know that we all are interested in learning more about the impact of religious concepts on our area from the past to the present. And so it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Anthony Stevens-Arroyo. Thank you very
much. The other title for this talk could be 300 Years in 50 Minutes. So let's get to it. I'm going to use the word slide to prompt our technician here. Let's understand what we're talking about. Throw away your Sunday school catechism definition of your religion to look at this one here. Religion as a worldview that connects people in social interactions to the cosmic forces of their faith. So that works whether the cosmic forces are Vishnu or Jesus or the Holy Spirit or Abraham. We have here a definition that will talk about all of the religions. And what we're talking about is dynamics. And the focus is on people, not on buildings. There is a walking tour, for instance, of Stroudsburg, issued and used by the Historical Association, and it visits all the churches on Main Street except one, St. Luke's, which is a Catholic church. St. Luke's has more people going to Sunday services than any of the other churches on Main Street. But it doesn't fit the category of a building being old enough for history. But if we look at religion in terms of people, then we really can't avoid, or we shouldn't exclude, all these different manifestations, regardless of how old the building is. So this dynamics is going to be looking at patterns, looking at effects, looking at social interactions, and it's not going to cover everybody. So you're welcome to criticize me already that I didn't mention your group or your church or this person. But that's because I want to make this an invitation to you to contribute and be a part of the Historical Association's ongoing work at understanding our roots, and by understanding our past, we can better predict our future. One little thing I'll say is that I'm going to use the old concepts of Protestant and Catholic because the word Christian has come into vogue, but sometimes it gets awkward whether Catholics or Christians and so forth. So just to avoid those kinds of issues, the use of the word brotherhood is also in the older documents, and it's not so much used now for different reasons. So pardon that ahead of time. I'm only be relying on the sources. Slide. So the first thing we want to do is, where does inspiration come from? And if you look at nature, there is this feeling of the intelligent design behind all the seasons that predict human behavior and interactions in terms of things like hunting and sowing and growing. And that is what we call earth religion. What people do to celebrate those events and insert themselves in those forces is they lose their personal identity to become part of the forces of nature, the cosmic forces that govern those seasons. Now, slide. On the other hand, book religion, as the name suggests, doesn't ask us to be present for the manifestation of the cosmic forces, but we can read about it. So Moses was in front of the burning bush. We weren't, but we can read about his experience and share in it because of that reading. And slide. And one of the advantages of book religion is that it is historically based. So we can identify as real people the persons who were the actors in creating the faith deposit. One other thing to be said is that earth religion is the basis for our contact. Book religion is like the second floor. So that when you belong to a book religion, you haven't entirely dismissed the basic idea of looking at the skies and saying the power of God is here. And we'll see that is a big, big part of the experience of Monroe County and its religious experiences. Slide. Now, to give an example of the sort of thing I like to do, there were two tribes here in 1721 when the Europeans first arrived, the Shawnee and the Lenape. And the Shawnee were from a different place. Well, how did they get to be here? Here in Pennsylvania instead of Ohio. Slide. Well, the story is that the Dutch along the Hudson River found out, as this dialogue with the Iroquois, that they could get beaver pelts, which had great deal of sale value in Europe. Slide. Because these were water resistant and very heavy. So the Iroquois said to the Dutch Calvinists, who were their traders, that they could get more pelts if they had guns. And because at that particular time, Calvinists kind of thought if you were born into heathenism, you're going to be heathen, you were predestined to be so, they didn't mind. And slide, we then had what we call the Beaver Wars. And the Iroquois subdued the Shawnee in Ohio with their allies. Slide. And you'll see there the Shawnee in yellow and slide. And because of that pressure from the Iroquois, they fled west, south, and some people made their way all the way to Pennsylvania. So that's why we have Shawnee on the Delaware. You got it. Such a smart group. All right, slide. When the Shawnee and the Lenape asked for guns from the Moravians and the Quakers in Pennsylvania, because of their religion, the Quakers and the Moravians said no. So the Indians had to get their guns from the French. Thus, the French and Indian War. Slide. So the European nations affected the First Nations. Slide. And more importantly, the near extinction of beaver damaged the environment. The loss of the dams led to flooding, swamps, dry forests, without game, and liable to forest fires. Slide. And so the destruction of the nature attacked the religion of the natives, their earth religion, even before anything else had happened. But don't worry, Tecumseh was a Shawnee, and he led a revolution against the United States, kind of like getting even. Slide. All right, let's take a look at the Christianity in the Poconos, and these are mostly Protestant groups that came from England and Holland. Slide. And we have a historical source that lists some of the groups that were here. So I don't know if there's any Schwendenkelders and Harmonists and Separatists and Labadists among us. But what's interesting about this is that the list of these folks, they practice the same faith, but in different language groups. And so the author calls it a Tower of Babel, a religious Babel here in the Poconos. But what's the key is they found in the wilderness the opportunity to worship better away from the maddening crowd up here in our beautiful mountains. Slide. Now, the first recorded building is a log cabin in 1737, and then a stone building, which is the one you see drawn here, with no photography, back in 1753. And it was used by Presbyterians, Dutch Reform, Lutherans, German Reform, and Baptist congregations. They found a way to share. Isn't that wonderful? And slide. And just so that you want to know, you can, if you can find it, driving along the Delaware, there's a plaque about this first church. And let's not give up on the Calvinists, because the New Light Presbyterians, who were different from the Old Light Presbyterians, decided that they should preach to the natives. And so a very famous preacher, David Bernard, working for the Scottish Society for Propagating Christian Knowledge, lived here among us in 1743. And the New Light founded Princeton, because Yale was too stale and old-fashioned. And in Dartmouth, they opened up a college for Indians. There you go. Slide. The institutions of Christian life. This gets very complicated, but if you look at Christianity, there's three basic pillars. One is governance. Leaders give orders. They may be holy orders, but they're orders nonetheless. And people become a part of that structure when they, say, I belong to church because I was baptized. I was married in this church. My family was buried from this church. So people become a part of governance as they integrate themselves through these rites of passage that are otherwise called sacraments. Then there are the faith sources. The basic reason people are in religion is so that they can practice a harmony among themselves and be fortified by that. And from that comes the scriptures and the reading of scriptures. But all of this social events is only going to be effective when it affects individuals and touches their wills, their hearts, and their minds. And so the religious experience was this interior awareness of the divine power in a life of holiness. Now, as time goes on, the Christian church over 1,000 years adapted that governance. Governance began to assume some of the trappings of secular power. It was impossible for everyone to live together in the same way that the apostles had seen. And so they created specialized communities in monasteries and convents for people to engage in that very intense shared life. And the mystical communion with God is what created some of the saints and the martyrs from the time. Slide. Now you take a look here on the pictures of different churches. All of these churches are built with wood, glass, some form of stone or brick, with cement or plaster. And yet they're all very different. So the constituent elements of each of these buildings, like the constituent elements in Christianity, are basically the same. But they're in a different design and a different proportion for a different purpose. And so they're all churches, just like they're all a part of one another, but they're still very distinct. So in talking about the similarity of these religions and of these churches, especially in Christianity, that's not to say that there are no differences. Slide. And then, of course, we had Reform. And one of the tragic parts of Christianity was that in the 16th century, the question of how do you get rid of bad leaders, which was always to get better leaders, to change them, suddenly became a question of where does the authority come to choose those leaders. And in somewhat the same way, there was a rejection of the need of belonging to a religious order to live this Christian life in a special way. And the discipleship for charismatic leaders was now seen as coming directly from their contact with that cosmic force, with God, the Holy Spirit, seen through the scriptures. And we have little pictures of John Hus. The guy with the hammer is Martin Luther, who helped build this place. We have John Calvin. And let's not leave out the Catholic Reformation. This is Ignatius Loyola. Catholics had their own experience. They also responded to those challenges. So, for instance, with indulgences, the other three guys said indulgences are being sold, so get rid of the indulgences. And the Jesuits said, well, if you don't sell them, you can keep them. So with that sort of thinking, we can see a Catholic reform as well. Slide. Our Moravians. The Moravians were the most dynamic of the early churches here. Why? Because they reached out to the natives who were here. They can be traced to 1757 in Moravia, which was part of the remnants of those that followed John Hus, and they found refuge, slide, under the aegis of a count, a German count, Zinzendorf, who was a Lutheran of his own kind of making. He was a pacifist, did not believe in different in oaths to governments, slide. And it is said that he was moved by this very picture of Christ, ecce homo. And he said, rather than a Christianity of rules that separate church from another, we could unify all Christians if we would just look at the suffering Christ and meditate on how he has saved us. And so the Moravians founded Bethlehem right down the road here in 1741, and Zinzendorf came to visit America in 1742. Slide. You'll see here that his basic contact with Daniel Brodhead, who was one of the first settlers, is celebrated in these different signs that you passed by 100,000 times and couldn't stop to read because they were honking at you. But There you go. And the important thing is that Brodhead actually became a part of the Moravian movement and religion, and donated the land upon which was built. You see in yellow the text that's already provided by Monroe County Historical Association, that they built a mission with 9 missionaries and 28 people who took communion in that small chapel. And the Brodhead people and the family was to be very famous in the history of this area, and certainly the Moravian faith played a role in that slide. Now, I looked at the way the Moravians preached, and it's very important, to me at least, to see how many similarities they had to the approach of the Catholic Dominican priest Bartolomé de las Casas and the French Jesuits in Canada, where their idea of working with the natives was to abandon your own place and go and live as brothers among those people. And so the Moravians did that. The historian says they discussed very little of abstruse theological doctrine, but confined themselves almost exclusively to the atonement, or as they styled it, to the wounds of the Lamb. And natives were attracted to this religion of the God with the wounded side. In fact, Tediuskun, the Lenape chief, was baptized by the name of Gideon by the Moravians. The Moravians, kind of like with their Lutheran contacts, used vestments and candles, which the Dutch Reform did not approve of very much. But the Indians loved it because they had their own rituals. There was a kind of cultural connection there. And the fact that they didn't take oaths, that they only had one Lord, and that was the Lord Jesus, also made them a threat to the civil authorities. Slide. And of course, the tragic moment is in the aftermath of the walking purchase, which alienated the natives here from the European settlers, led to an attack by Tediuskun, armed with guns from the French, on Dansbury Mission, December the 11th, 1755, wiped out the settlement, and the Moravians never returned. Slide. But the Moravians' legacy connects to the Methodists. And so this history here is about John and Charles Wesley, Slide, who tried to convert the people of Georgia to Christianity. Not today's Georgia, but Georgia from way back when. And they did not have much success. And their contact with Moravians, and later, and this is from their own testimony, after a reading of Martin Luther's preface to the Epistle to the Romans, John Wesley came to the understanding of his good works and his relationship. And it says, for the first time in his life, he felt peace and the assurance of salvation. So, if you're a Methodist, tip your hat to the Lutherans and to the Moravians, because they got you to where you are now. Slide. The Great Awakenings is a very intense and developed term in history of religions. The basic idea is that when people first settled as pioneers, building their log cabins and what have you, they're only concerned about material things. Where am I going to eat? Where am I going to get fresh water? And so forth. But after a while, as they get established, they begin to turn their minds to more religious and spiritual things. The first Great Awakening was to challenge whether the Church of England was doing its job, which was a prologue to saying the head of the Church of England, the King of England, isn't doing his job. Let's have a revolution. So that was the first Great Awakening. But the one that most directly attaches itself to us here in Monroe County is the so-called Second Great Awakening, which is around 1828, the time of Jeffersonian democracy. And the most important of these movements in terms of our particular locale are the holiness and evangelical movements that talked about stressing the faith by getting witness from former sinners. So this idea was that the religion will be renewed by hearing how God has witnessed and given his love and mercy to others. And so that became a very interesting movement that reanimated the faith of many. Along with that were utopian communities where people felt they didn't want to be contaminated with others. So the Church of Latter-day Saints, otherwise known as Mormons, were in that mold, as were the Oneida and the Brentwood communities were very self-sufficient. The people in the Brentwood community decided that there should be no marriage, there should be free love. And all their neighbors looked up and they said, all these people with free love, that's like Babylon. And that's factually how Babylon, Long Island, got its name. Bet you didn't know that, but that's actually the truth. But the key thing for us, and this is something still to be researched, is that this Second Great Awakening led to temperance movements, anti-slavery movements, reform movements, women's rights movements. And it had impact on the existing denominations. The Quakers most visibly were affected by this. Presbyterians, Old Lights and New Lights. The Methodists, who separated from the Episcopalians, were also themselves divided as to whether they had bishops or just Congregationalists. They were divided by race. The American Methodist Episcopal Church and the American and Southern Baptists separated over the question of slavery. So politics and patriotism got involved with lots of these discussions. And this is an important point that's still affecting us today. And we need, as I said here, to gather information from these movements to understand the development of our Monroe County. Slide. What I like to think about is Monroe County as periphery. And I get this slide from some great historians. And the basic idea is this, that people at the core who are surrounded by elements of their power and their status quo are unlikely to make innovations. But people far out on the periphery are facing challenges without the resources of people at the core. So they're more inclined to look for solutions to problems and to think creatively about what they can do. And so the question becomes, did Monroe County produce religious innovations? Because surely Monroe County was periphery historically, in terms of numbers, not being a part of Pittsburgh or Scranton or Philadelphia or New York or even New Jersey. And so, slide. What we do see is that our area became very popular as a place of concentration for what were called camp meetings. Most popular among the Methodists, where this is the witness about people being reformed, and people would come from all over to the Poconos in order to live under, the skies and tents and what have you, for a week of time of reestablishing their religious fervor. And many of the resorts in our area started out in this religious scope. There is a lot of information in the Historic Association about how they became our resort industry. But I think we should take a look again in terms of this dynamics of how many of these were religious organizations, including a tenement and Unity House, which was owned by the International Lady Garment Workers Union and brought many Jews into this area, which previously had been seen as Christians. And I mentioned Hillside Inn because Carrie's here. No, not because Hillside Inn, because that's a very famous part of what I think called the Green Book, where African Americans could not go to just any resort in the Poconos, and so there was a special resort for black people that was here. So that's part of our background. Slide. The point of view to take from this part of the presentation is that faith in the Poconos reconnects believers with nature and the inspirational qualities of earth religion. Slide. Now, is religion the uniter or the divider? If you look at the picture there, you'll see that for the Sistine Chapel and Michelangelo, it's the Judgment Day of the damned and the saved. But in terms of one box there, like-minded people of different denominations, let's say, for instance, the issue of slavery or the ancient movement for women or the temperance movement, they would join together. The German language joined people who were Reformed as well as those for Lutherans. And what people held in common was the reading of the Bible. But on the other side, it was a division because of political parties that adopted a particular part of a religious movement and emphasized that. And you're not going to be very temperament if you're a beer-drinking Lutheran, because, that's an important part of your culture. And the biggest issue is marriage with other people of other faiths. And so how does that develop if you have a Presbyterian married to a Methodist? Which religion, or you couldn't do both, how's it going to work out? Slide. And particularly this affects what happened to the Quakers here, who had been so influential. They had welcomed Daniel Stroud. Slide. He's the guy that is in that mansion of ours. And this is a rendition of a typical Quaker meeting, which is done in silence and in reflection, looking for the inner light. But when a person who was Quaker married someone who was not, the tendency was to shun both persons and exclude them from the meeting house. And this contrasts with the Catholics that said, hey, you can marry somebody else, but the kids have to be raised Catholic. And so with the Catholic, intermarriage would actually increase the number of people in the church, whereas with the case of the Quakers, it led to fewer and fewer persons. Slide. This is the history of the Lutherans in Hamilton Township, which don't have to, I mean, this is already there. But they begin with service in somebody's farm, then they build the log cabin, then they build a stone church, they dedicate it, they get a minister, and then after 100 years they have a 200th anniversary, and in 1974 they say, you know what? The difference between Reform and Lutheran doesn't matter, we're one people. And so that is part of the dynamism of bringing people together. Slide. Cannot neglect to say that religion is affected by social class. There is a premise in the Enlightenment that anything that's emotional or dependent on symbols is somehow not logical and not pure reason. And so if you're a Pentecostal or Baptist or a Methodist and you pray out loud and you sing and you clap, and well, you couldn't be, pure logic the way the Enlightenment suggests. And if you're Catholic, you're not even on the ball score there. You can read there, if you wish, the statements of Miss A. Mitchell Palmer, who was quite a distinguished person of the last century here. And he talks about how the Quakers, with that prayer, were distracted by the shouting Methodists. You went too far. Go back.
Sorry.
The shouting Methodists. And then he says they built a new meeting house near the Episcopalians who had divine angelic voices. I think there's a little prejudice in there. So after all, the Episcopalians have rituals, and as people saw with the coronation of Charles III, people eat it up, all that pomp and circumstance. So that has its value. Really, in human life, you really can't avoid that. Slide. What's interesting is that people feel most comfortable in a church with persons of their class and culture. Birds of a feather flock together, okay? But the temptation is, if you want to move up the social register, leave behind the Baptist and become a Methodist. There's a little joke that the difference between the Baptist and the Methodist is a Methodist is a Baptist who learned how to read. Terrible statement, but that's a sort of thing that is a part of the way people look at religion. Slide. Now, the Masons, who are very much interested in reason and the deists, curiously have lots of secret rituals and symbols. And they're dressed up in some fancy stuff there. But you know what? You can't repress symbols. You can't repress these sorts of expressions of secrecy with special knocks and different kinds of handshakes. And most importantly, and something I think neglected in our history here in Monroe County, is that Protestant middle class expectations usually included becoming a Mason. Slides. Civil War. Did you know there's no statue of a Civil War soldier in Monroe County? It was not a popular war. And because it was identified with the Republicans, who saw it as a quasi-religious mission to set men free in the famous Battle Hymn of the Republic, Monroe County became very much identified with the Democratic Party for at least 100 years. Looked at in more specific terms, the loss of life meant there was a labor shortage in the country. And because soldiers had traveled all over the country, some of them for the first time beyond their own communities, there was a new sense of national consciousness. And that was the expression, "Go west, young man, go west." California and the Wild West opened up opportunities for people that otherwise would have been dirt poor farmers. But all of this was motivated by the industrialization that was going on in factories and the railroads, which intensified the post-war industrialization, which created a need for proletariat, use a famous word, an urban proletariat. Slide. And so it was the best of times, the worst of times. A little tip of the hat to Dickens. The Gilded Age of railroad barons took place alongside urban huddled masses and exploited farming. Slide. The immigration in the 1870s was very different from the earlier immigration in many ways. The old country still sent people, but they had been drained dry, England, Scotland, and Germany. And in the 1870s, the Germans that came out of Bismarck's Kulturkampf, which was an oppression of Catholicism. So they came with a political awareness they didn't have before. The heaviest immigration was from Italy, 4 million people. The Austro-Hungarian minority, Slovaks and Hungarians, also decided to leave because of oppression. And Poland, there was no Poland on the map in 1870. Half of Poland was under Russia and the other half under Prussia. And both the Jews and the Catholics felt oppressed by their new masters. And so that created immigration. Jewish immigration, especially after the assassination of Tsar Alexander II by a Jew, there was a tremendous pressure, pogroms on Jews in Russia, and they fled to the United States. If I were a rich man, la, 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 la. You saw it, right? That's out of this experience. And people oftentimes think of immigration only in terms of Europe, where in fact the conquest of the Mexican territories in 1848, 50% of Mexico and 100% of Puerto Rico in 1898 also created a diversity of the population. Now, the point here is that this second wave of immigration was received by the first wave of immigrants. And so when the Irish got off the boat in New York or in Boston, they were met with somebody offering them a house, a job, and status. And the only thing they had to do was to vote for my man. And this process worked like a well-oiled machine. The German Catholics took advantage of something called the Verein. The Verein was a place where you had a meeting hall, you had sports teams, and you could borrow money in a mutual society from the Verein. It was very well organized. Italians had a padrone system, and they began thinking of themselves not as Sicilians and Neapolitans, but as Italians unified under one king. Slovak and Polish minorities were free to mobilize politically. Mexican and Cuban exiles found refuge in trying to foment revolutions in their own home. And Jews organized socially and politically for separation of church and state, unburdened any longer by feudalism. Slide. Basic point is that whereas earlier Protestant groups had come to the U.S. to escape discrimination, the Catholic and Jewish groups came to the U.S. and found discrimination still existed. Slide. And so here are some very potent political cartoons that are self-explanatory and rather derogatory. This one is about Polish vagabonds, Irish paupers, Russian anarchists, Italian mafia, and German socialists. Slide. Uncle Sam's supposed to be wary. Slide. This is one where the immigrants, you see the Irish, very simian-looking, the black person, the French person, the guy with the dunce cap is supposed to be a Pole, and they're asked to build a wall to stop the immigration from China. And the other side is Uncle Sam, a banker, a Jewish banker, who is robbing by reason of a banknote the farm of this genuine American. Slide. But the burden of opprobrium was against Catholics. And so you see a picture here of Leo XIII presented as an octopus strangling Lady Columbia. Catholic priest is going to be the president of the United States. The nuns are going to destroy the public school. And on the other side, you have a picture of the bishops wearing their mitres coming out of the water like alligators to consume the real Americans' huddled masses. Pretty nasty stuff. Slide. And slide. And the culmination is that the real Americans are going to defeat the Pope, who's lying there dead. Whoop, back. And he's got in one hand the American flag, the other hand the American Bible, and he's got the cross of Christ on his chest. Oh, and did I mention he has a white sheep? over his face. This is real stuff, folks. Now, quote, we'll go to the next one. What do you do? Well, you know, there's a tendency. You don't want me? I don't need you anyway. And so Catholics in particular made lemonade from lemons by using an army of celibate men and women to organize, educate, and mobilize their people. Slide. And they did it with a chip on their shoulder. That's why when they had a team, it just wasn't the Irish, it was the Fighting Irish, right? Slide. And war is a great crucible for feelings. And so the Spanish-American War demanded Catholics become more patriotic, and the First World War had German Americans to show more loyalty to the U.S. than Germany. Slide. Now, I want to connect a lot of discrimination to real economic and political problems that were taking place. Because many of these immigrants who were involved with unionization were in fact immigrants. And so labor strife was the part of the conflict that people felt. And we'll see that the period 1870 begins with the rebels being named Doyle, Kerrigan, and Kelly, and then shifting to Fisher and Schaub, which are German, and finally Sacco and Vincetti. So we'll go slide. The Molly Maguire trials took place in Mauchunka. Did you know that some of the Molly Maguires were incarcerated right here in Stroudsburg? And Judge Dreher, after whom the street is named, was one of the judges at the trial of the Molly Maguires. Slide. The Johnstown flood was really not a labor strike, but it showed the disdain of the upper class towards the people. Slide. Homestead was a terrible, violent strike out in Pittsburgh. Slide. Hazleton had an attack of killing 19 miners with the KKK led by the local sheriff. And the Pennsylvania State Police were organized to stop the communists, meaning labor organizers. Slide. And Bethlehem Steel also had its own piece. Slide. So what was the response to this? On the Catholic side, there was a creation of unions, official unions, the first one being Knights of Labor. Slide. They were founded in Reading, and their first important president was Terence Powderly, born in Carbondale and mayor of Scranton, and one of the people that anticipated some of the programs would come to be known as the New Deal. Slide. And then we had the Knights of Columbus in Connecticut, who were formed to give credit to needy Irish and Catholic immigrants. And they like to dress up too, just like the Masons. So you got those fancy plumes and swords. Some things go around and never change. Slide. But the most important change was with Rerum Novarum, an encyclical of Pius Pope Leo XIII. And read today, it doesn't sound very, radical at all. But it does attack laissez-faire capitalism, talks about workers' rights and a living wage. And coming as it did from a reactionary Catholic Church, it was a tremendous breakthrough in 1892. Slide. And it was a Catholic counterpart to things that had already been taking place in the Protestant and Jewish support for labor reforms. Slide. And it didn't come a moment too soon, because we had very rapidly the Mexican Revolution and then the Russian Revolution. And did you know that at the end of the First World War, some of the American soldiers formed an American Legion to invade Russia and get rid of the communists? And in reprisal for that, some of the supporters of the socialist movements sent letter bombs to officials in the US of A, which led, slide, to what were called the Palmer Race. And there's our friend A. Mitchell Palmer, who his family had deep roots here in Monroe County, and was actually part of the government of President Wilson. Slide. So I asked the question about labor in Monroe County. These were national trends, but did any of it affect and fall over into Monroe County? Well, we didn't have very much industry. Most of the industry here was based on family enterprises and didn't employ anywhere near the number of workers that you would find in the factories that were unionized that way. Slide. What is most famous is the Kiston Woolen Mills, opened up in 1873 on Main Street. You've all seen that building, right? They, like so many American businesses, had to close in 1978. But as I understand, it's a very nice condo arrangement now. Slide. East Stroudsburg had heavier industries. This is from a glass producing factory. And if you look at the bottom row, you'll see very young workers. People typically stopped going to school, 8th grade, first year of high school, and would go to work. Slide. And then the most famous was the locomotive repair unit. So if people say the railroad is coming to Stroudsburg, it's really returning to Stroudsburg. Slide. Well, the question is, did discrimination against worker unions, Catholics, and Jews in the U.S., which is real, did it infect Monroe County? I don't know. First time you heard me say that, but I don't know. Slide. But there is one answer possible. Slide. Roseto, PA, was a town founded a mile away from Bangor. Roseto was 100% Italian, working in the mines, slate quarries, and Bangor was 99.9% non-Italian. So the question arises, is there any discrimination? Slide. Of course, the Italians are very smart. They love being Italian and by themselves. So it's actually one of the healthiest places in the world to live with fewer heart attacks. And slide. You don't have to be Italian to go to Roseto and celebrate meatballs and Our Lady of Mount Carmel. So check it out in July. Slide. Second question is a little more substantial. This county, faithful to Democrats since 1860, voted Republican in 1928. Slide. When Al Smith was a Catholic, was a presidential candidate. And so you'd have to think that there was some effect of discrimination that was present at that time. Slide. But that didn't keep us from becoming more prosperous and more religious. And so we're looking at the Episcopal Church that had stopped being the Church of England because of obvious reasons, the Revolution, and had a very late arrival here. But there was this discovery, here in quotes, in 1897, some professionals and people found themselves to be Episcopalian. And so they started small, slide, with services in the Kidney Hotel in the Delaware Water Gap. That was how they started. Then in 1904, they started building their first church, which was on 7th Street, slide. And then the present church you'll recognize on A Street, slide. And you'll see there, one of the nice things, that one of the first woman priest in Monroe County is going to be from the Episcopal Church. So they enriched our religious expression very much. Slide. Roman Catholics, here comes everybody, more or less at the same time. The original building was put up by the railroad for the Irish workers who were laying the rails in the woods and so forth. And this is now Brown Street. It was expanded, but this was St. Matthew's Church. But you can't have a Catholic parish without a pastor, and a pastor for Roman Catholics is an educated celibate male. And so this was an outrider chapel. Didn't belong to a specific parish, but a priest would come on different weekends. And virtually all the churches of this area that are Catholic began somehow or other as this outrider, which is the way that the Methodists used to do it as well. And retired Father Francis Kraft of Milford was invited by Bishop Hoban to be the first pastor of St. Matthew's. That was 1902. And interestingly, Father Kraft used to raise money for the church by celebrating Mass down at Delaware Water Gap with the very wealthy Irish and other Catholics that he found there. Slide. That's the way you see St. Matthew's now, a far cry from the little clapboard church. Slide. This Father Kraft is a most interesting man, and he deserves a lecture on his own. Slide. Did you know, slide, that his grandfather was a Revolutionary War general, and his grandmother was a Mohawk? His father was a doctor. Slide. Came to Milford for the climate. Slide. He was sent to Louvain in Belgium to become a doctor. Instead, he converted to Catholicism and joined the Jesuits. Slide. He was ordained for the Dakota Missions. If you look at the picture, oops, going too fast, go back. He's got his mission cross on, and what he's holding in his hand is a peace pipe. Slide. He learned the native language, he wore the dress, and he took a blood rite. To become a brave, you have to shed blood. So he shed his blood in his rite, and he consecrated the Lakota Nation to the Sacred Heart of Jesus. Slide. Sitting Bull was in his parish. This is a famous picture of Sitting Bull. But slide. Did you notice he's wearing a missionary cross that was given to him by Father Kraft? Slide. He sent a buffalo robe, Father Kraft did, to Pope Leo XIII. This is a drawing of how the Native Americans celebrated in Rome. Slide. He founded a religious order of Sioux women. And they called them the American Sisters because they wanted to emphasize they were really American. Slide. And he was wounded at the Wounded Knee Massacre. Basically, it was in his parish, and the soldiers were on one side and Sitting Bull's followers on the other. He stood in the middle, and he got knifed and shot while he was hearing the confession of one of the dying soldiers. And he was reported as dead the next day, but he managed to survive and returned to Milford, which is where the bishop found him and invited him to become pastor. Slide. Let's talk about the faith of Israel. And notice the pattern, that there's a celebration in a home. Russian-born Nathan Abeloff, slide, gives his home with a borrowed Torah for Sukkoth. And you must have the Word of God. And the Torah is the Word of God. So that creates this worship place for that. The congregation bought land at Brown Street, slide, opens up with the congregation, affiliates with conservative Judaism, slide. And then one of the most famous members of that church is Lester Abeloff, who died just about 10 years ago. He was a Stroudsburg native son, who was notable in business and philanthropy, and he was Jewish. Now, the question is, he was notable in business and philanthropy. Was that because he was Jewish? Very interesting question to ask. Slide. And then we have it's not the only religious place for Jews today in our area, but that's the most prominent building on Wallace and Avenue A. Slide. Now, as we enter the 20th century, and I'm nearing the end of the talk here, so you can survive. The majority of Americans were Protestant. And there was this projection of Americanism. The old ethnic divisions and the Protestants had evaporated and eroded. And there was a presumption if you read the Bible, you were going to read the so-called Protestant Bible, the St. James Version. If you said prayers like the Our Father, for thine is the kingdom and the glory, and the Catholics would yell out, and deliver us from evil, amen, while the Protestants went on for something else. But it was this kind of, I'll call it a soft discrimination that, look, Protestant is the norm. And we're talking 1900, 1910, 1920. And so there's this parallel development with Catholics and Jews, Muslims and Mormons, that they have to have parallel institutions, religious schools. But they're seen as being outside the pale of what would be the norm. Slide. As they say in Star Trek, resistance to the dominant culture is futile. But we can ask the question of whether there was an overreach. So you had the Prohibition Amendment, you had the Scopes trial where they tried to control what books would be talking about evolution, and a resistance from people who weren't Protestant to those laws that were passed or attempt to do so. Slide. And as good as it looked, recognize that even if you were Protestant, if you were an ex-slave, you were segregated. Native Americans, Mexicans, and Puerto Ricans were considered inferior Americans and oftentimes treated as immigrants, when in fact it was the United States that migrated to conquer their lands rather than the other way around. And religious nationalism of any kind, a support for the Irish Rebellion, whatever, was looked at with askance. Slide. Then came the Great Depression, to be followed by the Second World War. Slide. And so at the end of the Depression, the Second World War, that guy's grabbing a woman and kissing her. But there was a feeling everybody was one. We came through it. This is the greatest generation. Slide. And there emerged something called civil religion, which was no longer just Protestant, but Protestant, Catholic, and Jew. Slide. And so you began seeing positive images of nuns and priests. You saw Sam Levinson telling jokes about Talmud school, Jackie Robinson hitting home runs, and of course there's a Crazy Lucy, you know. So we had the Hispanic presence in Desi Arnaz and I Love Lucy. But as soon as the 50s started that, slide, we began getting just the opposite. Slide. So we have segregation, civil rights, racial conflicts, drugs and crime, the hippie culture, black power, the Americans protesting the war in Vietnam, and Malcolm introducing Islam as an alternative for African Americans. Slide. Now, the greatest event, and I'm speaking from a Catholic point of view here, but a real one, let's call it the II Vatican Council, was the great awakening for the Catholic Church. And what happens is that we form the practices. So scripture study with Protestants and Jews, introduction to morals, modern science. They got out of the habit of wearing things that separate them from the world. So there are a lot of Elvis Presley movies about that. And the incorporation of laity in decision-making was very key. Slide. Go back to the idea of the core and periphery. What the Second Vatican Council did was to give more influence to the periphery of the Catholic experience and not reserve all the decisions to the Vatican alone. And you, who may or may not be Catholic, should notice that Protestants and Catholics are singing the same hymns now. I open up my Catholic hymn book, I got Wesley, I got Luther, I got them all. And you probably have some Catholic hymns in Marty Hagen and what have you. Priest faces the people. There was a feminization of ministries. A lot of people who are in Protestant churches will say, you call that feminization, you Catholics? But when you understood where we were before, you realize women take a bigger and bigger role in Catholicism today. And finally, worship is in the language of the people. Slide. So faith and culture. This is my last major point I want to make. Faith is not culture, but faith cannot be expressed without a culture. Slide. So give the example of water. Faith is the water, and you pour it into a glass. The water assumes the shape of the glass. The glass can be different, but the faith inside of it is still the same. Slide. But the question is, should religion change culture or conserve it? That's a big question, because, I mean, you could have a glass that has, holes in it, so it's not going to hold the faith unless you change it. Slide. And we see how this Protestant Babel of the Poconos with all the different nationalities has really evolved into a climate of mergers. So back in the 80s and the 90s, you have the United Methodist Church and the United Church of Christ, and ELCA, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, and so forth. Slide. And where would the Presbyterians be without Koreans? I mean, that's a basic question. Or the Episcopalians without people from the islands. The Catholic experience is somewhat different because they have a Mass in Latin, but then they had separate churches for the different language groups, as long as the bishop controlled everything, which led to a huge fight. That same Bishop Hoban in Scranton saw and witnessed the separation of the Polish community to create the Polish National Church, 1897. Slide. But the biggest issue, slide, is Catholicism and Latinos. And with the post-Second World migration, older Catholic groups, Irish and Italians, moved out of the cities, and Latinos from Mexico and Puerto Rico and other places moved in. And the question was, we're going to build new parishes for each of these when we have empty churches from before. And so the Catholic Church decided on a policy of integrated parishes. Remember what they did in 1755 over here in Shawnee, was they had the different religion, different denominations using the same church. So now at places like St. Luke, you have a Mass in Polish, Mass in English, and other places, Mass in Spanish, Haitian, what have you. Slide. This is all recorded in a famous book called Catholicism on Fifth Avenue, written by a person who is a member of St. Luke's Parish. You may know her. I know her biblically. She's my wife sitting right here. I'm Maria Diaz-Stevens. Right now, Latinos are the most typical Catholic family. Slide. So, here we come to the end of our talk. There are new winkles in religion. Pardon the pun. Remember Rip Van Winkle? He fell asleep and then he woke up and he couldn't see different things. Slide. Well, take a look at what happened. If you fell asleep in 1970, Monroe County was really periphery with 45,000 people. 2000, 30 years later, 132,000 people, which is a spectacular 192% increase. Slide. So you can see the way that things have changed. Now, there are reasons for it, but some of the basic facts. Most people in Monroe County were not born here. Catholics have supplanted Methodists as the largest denomination. And there are people from denominations that were never here before that have started and sprung up. There's a Hindu retreat down in Salisbury, along with the Islamic one. And so there's a great challenge to traditional religious loyalties. If the idea was I'm a Lutheran or I'm a Catholic or I'm a Methodist because my family was raised here and born here and married here, they no longer apply. And if you bend over backwards for the new people, you might lose the old people. So how do you balance those things? And the fact is that 192% growth in the population has not resulted in 192% growth in mass or service attendance at any of our churches. So that's a different challenge. And the fact is, people look to non-religious groups for things that they used to find in church. Slide. And so John was gracious enough to introduce me. You read the last sentence talking about groups of do-gooding, social institutions that help people. Small wonder the churches, once the focus of togetherness and united action, began to regard these groups as competitors. Yet many of these are the logical outgrowths of religious principles. Slide. So this is the last slide I have. History is prologue to the future. Slide. And so how do we live in a secular society? Slide. We're never going to go back to the way it was before, but can we adapt as we have before to the new conditions? Slide. There is secularism that's anti-religious. Slide. But can we appeal to religion as motivations for bringing people together? Slide. Does the law have to reflect a religious faith? Or can it be used to create common ground? Slide. So we had an issue over a Bible and prayer in schools. Slide. Now, when you talk about religion in schools, you got to include Hinduism and Islam and who knows what else. So it opens up the door. Prohibitions versus alcohol. That was one of the laws that was passed, an amendment to the Constitution. Now the question is abortion and same-sex marriage. Those can be considered by religious people in one way, but do they have to pass a law so that everybody considers it the same way? Slide. Segregation of races. Can we make churches into a diversity of faith communities and make it a model for the country we want it to be? Slide. Do we create immigration laws and walls to keep foreigners out? We look to the churches as creating international cooperation. Do we have discrimination by language, or do we promote civic engagement on issues? Slide. Do we have a society run by old boys networks, or do we have diverse political and commercial choices? Slide. And most often we saw how patriotism affected in wars. Slide. Now we have a fight for democracy in our society. So how will we respond? Slide. Whatever we do, we have this return to unity and division, facing those contemporary challenges as we faced before. Thank you for your time.